In a concrete bunker beneath the Bendler block in Berlin, Colonel Friedrich Weber laid 3 intelligence reports side by side and felt the blood drain from his face. The numbers were impossible. America had shipped over 300,000 military vehicles to the Allies while simultaneously fighting a 2-ocean war against Japan. The Third Reich's entire motor vehicle production for 1,943 hadn't even reached 100,000 units. Colonel Friedrich Weber had spent his entire adult life with numbers. Before the war, he'd been an economics professor at Heidelberg University, specializing in industrial production metrics. His 1,936 dissertation, Comparative Manufacturing Capacity in Modern European States, had earned him quiet recognition in academic circles and, more dangerously, the attention of Wehrmacht intelligence. By March 1943, Weber directed a small analytical section within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Armed Forces High Command. His office occupied a cramped corner of the Bendler block, the massive stone building on Berlin's Landwehr Canal that housed Germany's military nerve center. Unlike most intelligence officers who focused on enemy troop movements and battle order, Weber's mandate was singular: track Allied industrial output and logistical capacity. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. It was tedious work, unglamorous. While other officers briefed senior commanders on dramatic frontline developments, Weber compiled spreadsheets of factory production figures, shipping manifests, and railway capacity estimates. His reports rarely made it beyond mid-level staff officers. The prevailing wisdom among German high command remained what it had been since 1941. America was industrially impressive but strategically incoherent, its production capacity diluted by having to supply both European and Pacific theaters while defending its own continental expanse. Weber himself had believed this. He'd written as much in his February 1942 assessment titled American Industrial Mobilization, Impressive Scale, Limited Strategic Impact. The report had been well received. It confirmed what everyone wanted to believe, that American production, while substantial, would be insufficient to fundamentally alter the war's trajectory in Europe, while Japanese forces tied down American military resources across the Pacific. But on March 18, 1943, 3 separate intelligence reports landed on Weber's desk within hours of each other, and the comfortable certainty he'd maintained for over a year began to crack. The first report came from Abwehr agents operating in Lisbon. Portugal's capital remained one of the few neutral zones where German intelligence could still function with relative freedom. A Portuguese dock worker, recruited for modest monthly payments, had photographed shipping manifests at the port of Lisbon. Allied convoys occasionally stopped there for refueling before continuing to North Africa or Britain. The manifests detailed cargo: 4,300 American-manufactured trucks aboard a single Liberty ship convoy bound for British forces in Egypt. Weber had stared at that number. 4,300 trucks in one convoy. His hand had moved automatically to his reference files. Germany's entire truck production for February 1943 had been 3,847 units, and those had to supply the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean Theatre, occupation forces, and homeland defence. The second report arrived from a captured British logistics officer interrogated at a POW facility outside Frankfurt. The British captain, a supply corps officer taken prisoner during the Kasserine Pass battle in Tunisia, had been remarkably forthcoming during questioning. Perhaps he'd assumed logistical information held no tactical value. Perhaps he'd simply wanted to boast. Either way, his testimony contained a revelation that Weber found deeply disturbing. The British officer described the volume of American vehicles flowing into North Africa through the ports of Oran and Casablanca. Hundreds of trucks arriving daily, he'd said. Jeeps, cargo trucks, amphibious vehicles, tank transporters, half-tracks. The Americans manufacture them faster than we can distribute them. We've got motor pools that look like automobile factories. The interrogator, unaware of the statement's significance, had filed the report routinely. But when it crossed Weber's desk, He'd immediately cross-referenced it with captured Allied vehicle identification numbers from destroyed or abandoned equipment in Tunisia. The VIN sequences suggested production dates ranging across barely 3 months, January through March 1943, yet encompassed over 2,000 individual vehicles already documented in North African theatre operations. The third report came from the Luftwaffe Reconnaissance Analysis section. German aerial photography of British ports, Liverpool, Southampton, Bristol, revealed something that Weber's analyst mind immediately recognized as significant. The ports were crowded with vehicles, not ships, vehicles. Thousands of trucks, jeeps, and armored cars staged in massive marshalling yards, waiting for transport across the Channel or to other theatres. What disturbed Weber wasn't just the quantity visible in the photographs, it was the turnover rate. Comparing photos taken 3 weeks apart showed almost complete replacement of staged vehicles. The previous vehicles had clearly shipped out, new ones had taken their places. The implication was staggering. American production wasn't just supplying current operational needs, it was building up reserves, stockpiles, a logistical cushion that would allow sustained operations without production interruptions. Weber spent that evening doing calculations. He cross-referenced every piece of vehicle production intelligence his section had compiled over the previous 18 months. He analyzed shipping capacity data, convoy schedules, and port throughput estimates. He calculated production rates based on captured vehicle identification sequences. He estimated losses to U-boat activity and factored in vehicles diverted to Pacific operations. The numbers that emerged made no sense according to everything German planners understood about industrial capacity allocation. According to Weber's calculations, and he checked them 3 times, American vehicle production allocated to the European and North African theatres alone had already exceeded 180,000 units by March 1943, and this was while America simultaneously supplied its Pacific operations, maintained homeland defense, and built up reserves for future operations. The figure seemed impossible. Germany's total military vehicle production for all of 1,942 had been approximately 115,000 units, and Germany wasn't fighting a 2-ocean war. The entire Wehrmacht Eastern Front, North Africa, Western Europe, the Balkans had to share those 115,000 vehicles. Yet America, according to Weber's analysis, had already supplied nearly twice that number to just 2 theatres in roughly 15 months, while simultaneously conducting major operations across the entire Pacific. Weber compiled his findings into a 12-page report titled Preliminary Assessment, American Automotive Production Capacity and Strategic Implications. He submitted it through proper channels on March 23, 1943. The report disappeared into the Wehrmacht bureaucracy. Weber heard nothing for 2 weeks. On April 6, 1943, Weber was summoned to a briefing room on the Bendler block's 3rd floor. 3 officers sat waiting. Major General Ernst Müller from the Operations Directorate, Colonel Hans Dietrich from Logistics Planning, and Captain Otto Schneider, an aide-de-camp to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Wehrmacht High Command. Weber entered with his report folder and statistical appendices. He'd prepared to defend his findings with data and methodology. General Müller spoke first, his tone polite but dismissive. Colonel Weber, we've reviewed your report on American vehicle production. Your analysis contains some interesting observations. However, the figures you've presented seem to exceed what our own technical experts consider plausible, given known American industrial capacity. Weber had expected resistance. General, my calculations are based on direct physical evidence, captured vehicle identification numbers, convoy manifests, aerial reconnaissance of port facilities. The VIN sequences alone provide, yes. Müller waved his hand. But consider the source reliability. A Portuguese dockworker's photographs? A captured British officer's boasting? These are not what we would call definitive intelligence. The VIN sequences are definitive, Weber insisted. Each captured or destroyed American vehicle has a manufacturer's identification number. These aren't random, they indicate production dates and factory locations. By analyzing the sequence progressions, we can calculate production rates with considerable accuracy. Colonel Dietrich leaned forward. He was a logistics specialist, someone Weber had hoped might understand the implications. Even accepting your methodology, Colonel, your conclusions strain credibility. You're claiming America has already delivered nearly 200,000 military vehicles to theaters where they're simultaneously fighting in the Pacific? Not claiming, Colonel. Calculating. Based on evidence. But it's strategically incoherent, Dietrich continued. If America possesses such enormous production capacity, why hasn't it translated into decisive battlefield superiority? We've held North Africa for months. The Eastern Front remains stalemated. Where is this supposed industrial colossus you're describing? It was the logical objection, the reason his report seemed implausible even to him. The vehicles are being stockpiled, he said. Current intelligence suggests massive reserves being staged in Britain. The Americans aren't deploying everything they've shipped. They're building up capacity for a future operation. Muller's expression hardened. Speculation. Informed projection based on observed inventory patterns. Captain Schneider, who'd remained silent until now, spoke carefully. Colonel Weber, are you aware of Reich Marshal Goering's assessment of American industrial capacity? He's been quite clear that while America can produce consumer goods in impressive quantities, they lack the technical expertise and industrial focus to manufacture military equipment at scales that would threaten Germany's strategic position. There it was. The real reason for this meeting. Weber's report contradicted not just operational assumptions but ideological certainty. Goering had repeatedly proclaimed that Americans could make refrigerators and razor blades, but not tanks and trucks in quantities that mattered. I'm aware of the Reich Marshal's public statements, Weber said carefully. However, the physical evidence suggests a different reality. I'm not questioning anyone's judgment. I'm simply reporting what the data indicates. The data may be flawed, Muller suggested, or deliberately planted. The British are quite capable of manipulating shipping manifests to exaggerate their supply situation, making us believe they have greater reserves than they actually possess. Weber had considered this possibility. I've cross-referenced multiple independent sources. The pattern is consistent across all of them. Our own frontline commanders in North Africa have reported encountering unusually high numbers of American vehicles in excellent condition, suggesting abundant replacement capacity. Frontline impressions are notoriously unreliable, Dietrich countered. A commander facing enemy vehicles naturally overestimates their numbers. It's a known psychological effect. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. For every piece of evidence Weber presented, his superiors offered alternative explanations. The data was unreliable. The sources were compromised. The calculations made unwarranted assumptions. American vehicles were likely of such poor quality that high production numbers were necessary to compensate for rapid breakdown rates. When Weber pointed out that captured American trucks showed remarkable build quality and durability, Muller suggested this was selection bias. Only the best examples survived to be captured. When Weber referenced the Liberty ship program's documented production capacity and calculated vehicle transport capability, Schneider noted that many Liberty ships were undoubtedly being sunk by U-boats before reaching their destinations, making theoretical capacity irrelevant. Every objection was superficially reasonable. Each alternative explanation had some plausibility. Taken individually, any single piece of Weber's evidence could be questioned or reinterpreted. But Weber understood statistics. He understood that when multiple independent data streams all pointed toward the same conclusion, the cumulative probability of that conclusion being correct increased exponentially. The likelihood that all his sources were simultaneously wrong, that all the evidence was coincidentally misleading in the same direction, was vanishingly small. Yet his superiors seemed determined to interpret each piece of evidence in isolation, finding reasons to doubt each one without considering the pattern they formed together. The meeting ended with polite dismissal. General Muller thanked Weber for his diligence. Colonel Dietrich suggested that perhaps Weber's section should focus more on immediate tactical intelligence rather than broad strategic assessments. Captain Schneider said nothing but made a note in his leather portfolio. Weber left the briefing room, knowing his report would be filed away and forgotten. The Wehrmacht High Command had received information that contradicted their strategic assumptions, and rather than adjust those assumptions, they'd found reasons to reject the information. It was, Weber reflected as he walked back to his cramped office, exactly what he would have done in their position 6 months earlier. Comfortable certainties are always more appealing than disturbing possibilities. Weber considered dropping the matter. His career prospects in Wehrmacht intelligence depended on producing reports that senior commanders found useful, which generally meant reports that confirmed what they already believed. An analyst who persistently advocated uncomfortable conclusions was unlikely to advance, regardless of how well supported those conclusions might be. But Weber had spent his professional life in pursuit of truth through numbers. Academic training had instilled in him the principle that conclusions must follow evidence, not vice versa. The evidence of American industrial capacity kept accumulating, and it kept pointing in the same direction. Throughout spring and summer 1943, Weber continued compiling data, though he stopped writing formal reports. His filing cabinets filled with photocopied shipping manifests, interrogation transcripts, reconnaissance photographs, and captured equipment documentation. Each month, the picture grew clearer and more disturbing. A May intelligence summary from agents in Sweden reported observing Allied convoys of unprecedented size moving through international waters. A single convoy comprised 47 merchant vessels, 32 of which were identified as American Liberty ships. Assuming standard cargo loads, that single convoy could transport approximately 15,000 military vehicles. A June interrogation of a captured American truck driver from the 1st Infantry Division revealed that his unit's entire motor pool, over 200 vehicles, had been replaced within a 3-month period, not due to combat losses but simply due to normal wear. The old vehicles were sent to rear echelon units. The casual abundance this implied staggered Weber. German units kept vehicles operational through cannibalization and field repairs for years. The Americans apparently considered 3-month-old trucks ready for retirement. July brought aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Soviet Union's receiving ports, Murmansk and Archangel. German photo interpreters had documented thousands of American-manufactured trucks staged at these Arctic ports. The implications were profound. America was simultaneously supplying Britain, supporting operations in North Africa and Italy, maintaining Pacific operations, building up reserves for future European campaigns, and sending substantial vehicle quantities to the Soviet Union through the dangerous Arctic convoy route. The tonnage calculations alone seemed impossible, yet there were the photographs, showing endless rows of American trucks bearing Soviet markings. Weber created a new filing system. For each month from January 1942 through July 1943, he compiled all available intelligence on American vehicle deliveries to Allied forces. He categorized by theater: Britain, North Africa, Soviet Union, Pacific. He calculated minimum numbers based on documented evidence and maximum probable numbers based on shipping capacity and production indicators. Even his most conservative estimates produced figures that dwarfed German production. His more realistic calculations suggested America had already delivered over 250,000 military vehicles to Allied forces worldwide by mid-1943. Germany's cumulative military vehicle production for the same period was approximately 185,000 units, and Germany had been on war footing since 1939, had captured significant vehicle stocks from conquered territories, and wasn't fighting across 2 oceans simultaneously. The arithmetic was impossible to escape. America was outproducing Germany in military vehicles by a margin of at least 30–40%, possibly more, while also outproducing Germany in aircraft by similar margins, in ships by overwhelming margins, and maintaining a civilian economy that continued producing consumer goods at levels Germany hadn't seen since before the war. Weber sat in his office on the evening of August 12, 1943, looking at 2 years' worth of compiled data. He'd created a massive wall chart in his small office, tracking every data point he'd collected. The pattern was undeniable. America possessed industrial capacity on a scale that German planners had fundamentally failed to comprehend. The implications for Germany's strategic position were catastrophic, and no one in the Wehrmacht High Command wanted to hear about it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. General Kurt von Schelling had commanded panzer divisions in France, led armoured thrusts deep into Soviet territory, and earned the Knight's Cross for his tactical brilliance at Kharkov. By October 1943, he'd been reassigned to a position he considered beneath his capabilities, Inspector General of Panzer Forces for Western Defence. The appointment came with impressive title and meaningless authority. Von Schelling's actual job was to tour Atlantic Wall fortifications and assess Germany's armoured readiness for the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming eventually. He was 53 years old, recovering from wounds received on the Eastern Front, and increasingly aware that his new position existed primarily to keep experienced but physically compromised officers away from active combat commands. He approached the assignment with professional thoroughness anyway. Throughout October and November 1943, von Schelling travelled the French and Belgian coasts, inspecting fortifications, reviewing defensive plans, and examining the panzer divisions tasked with repelling the inevitable Allied landing. What he found disturbed him more with each passing week. The Atlantic Wall itself was impressive, in places massive concrete bunkers, intricate trench systems, elaborate obstacles stretching for miles, but von Schelling's trained eye recognized something his superiors seemed to have missed. Fortifications are worthless without mobile reserves to contain breaches and counterattack. Germany's armoured strength in the West was inadequate. Von Schelling counted 17 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions nominally assigned to Western defence. On paper, this seemed substantial. In reality, many were under strength, equipped with obsolete tanks, or positioned too far inland to respond quickly to coastal landings. More troubling was the fuel situation. During an inspection of the 12th SS Panzer Division near Köln, von Schelling learned that the division possessed enough fuel for approximately 150 kilometers of operations, barely enough to move from current positions to potential landing sites, and conduct one day of combat operations. After that, the division would be immobilized, waiting for fuel supplies that would have to travel through transportation networks the Allies would certainly target. Von Schelling was a tank commander. He understood that panzer divisions without fuel were merely expensive stationary gun emplacements. He began asking uncomfortable questions. Where were the fuel reserves? How quickly could they be transported to combat zones? What were the contingency plans if Allied air power interdicted supply routes? The answers were vague and unconvincing. Fuel was adequate for current planning assumptions. Transportation arrangements were being finalized. Alternative supply routes existed, but required coordination with multiple command authorities. In December 1943, von Schelling attended a planning conference in Paris. Senior Wehrmacht commanders gathered to discuss defensive preparations. The mood was confident. The Atlantic Wall would channel Allied forces into two killing zones. German tanks would strike landing beaches before enemy forces could consolidate. Artillery would devastate troops wading ashore. The Luftwaffe would contest Allied air superiority. Von Schelling listened to presentation after presentation, outlining how German forces would defeat the invasion. None of the presentations seriously addressed the fundamental question that kept him awake at night. What if the Allies landed with force levels that overwhelmed defensive capacity through sheer material abundance? During a break, von Schelling found himself speaking with Colonel Friedrich Weber, an intelligence analyst he'd met briefly years earlier. Weber had been invited to provide industrial production assessments, though his section wasn't formally part of the conference agenda. "You look troubled, General," Weber observed. Von Schelling lit a cigarette. "I'm worried we're planning to fight the invasion we want rather than the invasion we'll face. Tell me honestly, Colonel, what are your estimates of Allied material strength for the coming invasion?" Weber hesitated. "My estimates, or the official estimates? Yours." Weber glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. The Allies will land with vehicle support on a scale we cannot match. Conservative estimate. They'll bring ashore 50,000 vehicles in the first 2 weeks. Realistic estimate, possibly 80,000. They have the shipping capacity, the production capability, and they've been stockpiling in Britain for over a year. Von Schelling nearly dropped his cigarette. 80,000 vehicles? In 2 weeks? That's based on documented shipping capacity and observed British port activity. The Americans alone have delivered over 300,000 vehicles to Allied forces since 1942. A large percentage are staged in Britain awaiting the invasion. 300,000 vehicles? Von Schelling's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. That's... Colonel? Do you realize what you're saying? Germany's total production over the same period. I'm aware, General. I've written multiple reports on the subject. They've been consistently dismissed as overstated. Von Schelling absorbed this. His tactical mind immediately grasped the implications. If Weber's figures were even approximately correct, the Allies could sustain logistical operations at rates German forces couldn't possibly match. They could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. They could maintain offensive momentum through sheer material abundance, even if German defenders fought brilliantly. Why haven't your reports received more attention? Von Schelling asked. Weber smiled bitterly. Because people prefer comfortable conclusions to disturbing evidence. Because accepting my analysis would require acknowledging that we're facing industrial capacity we cannot overcome through fighting spirit or tactical excellence. Because it suggests Germany cannot win this war through military operations alone. You're describing strategic defeat as inevitable. I'm describing mathematical reality, General. Numbers don't care about ideology or determination. If one side can replace 3 tanks for every one the other side destroys, simple arithmetic determines the outcome, regardless of which side has better soldiers or tactics. Von Schelling finished his cigarette in silence. He'd seen enough combat to know that wars weren't won by superior courage alone. Logistics mattered. Industrial capacity mattered. The side that could keep more tanks running, more trucks moving, more artillery firing, inevitably won wars of attrition. He'd assumed that Germany's technical expertise and combat experience would offset Allied material advantages. But if those material advantages were as overwhelming as Weber suggested, no amount of technical skill or tactical brilliance would matter. Why are you still compiling these reports if no one listens? Von Schelling asked. Because someone should maintain an accurate record, Weber replied. Because truth matters even when it's inconvenient. Because someday, historians will ask how Germany's leadership could have been so catastrophically wrong about Allied capabilities, and there should be documentary evidence that not everyone was blind to reality. June 6, 1944, began for von Schelling with a phone call at 3:47 a.m. His aide's voice was tense. General, you need to come to headquarters immediately. The invasion has started. Von Schelling arrived at the Western Command Center in Saint-Germain-en-Laye to find organized chaos. Reports flooded in from Normandy paratroop landings, naval bombardment, amphibious assaults across multiple beaches. Officers crowded around maps, trying to determine the invasion's scale and primary objectives. Von Schelling studied the incoming reports with growing alarm. This wasn't a probing attack or diversionary operation. The Allies were committing massive forces across a broad front. Naval gunfire was described as unprecedented in intensity. Air cover was reported as absolute, no, Luftwaffe presence observed. By noon, reconnaissance reports from the coast painted a picture that von Schelling found almost impossible to credit. The English Channel was filled with ships. Observers reported counting over 1,000 vessels visible from single vantage points. The sky roared with continuous Allied aircraft. Landing beaches were described as carpeted with vehicles, tanks, trucks, amphibious carriers covering every metre of sand. Von Schelling had commanded mobile operations on the Eastern Front. He knew what large-scale mechanized warfare looked like. The descriptions coming from Normandy exceeded anything he'd experienced or imagined. By evening, the reports became more detailed and more disturbing. Allied forces had successfully landed on 5 beaches and were pushing inland. German counterattacks had failed to reach the coast. Allied naval gunfire and airstrikes destroyed every armoured formation that attempted to approach. One report stopped von Schelling cold. A reconnaissance officer described observing Allied vehicle offloading operations at Gold Beach. Continuous stream of vehicles driving directly off specialized landing ships. Conservative estimate: 1 vehicle every 45 seconds across multiple landing points. At observed rates, Allies are landing approximately 2,000 vehicles daily at single beach. Similar operations observed across all 5 beaches. Von Schelling did the arithmetic automatically. 2,000 vehicles per day per beach, across 5 beaches. 10,000 vehicles per day. In 1 week, the Allies could land 70,000 vehicles. In 2 weeks, 140,000. He remembered his conversation with Weber 6 months earlier. Weber had predicted 50,000 to 80,000 vehicles in the first 2 weeks. The actual rates were exceeding even Weber's realistic estimates. Weber learned about the invasion while at his Bendler block office, compiling his usual daily intelligence summaries. By mid-morning June 6th, fragmentary reports from France were being circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters. Weber read them with a sick feeling of vindication. Everything he'd predicted was happening. Everything his superiors had dismissed as implausible was manifesting as reality. The scale of Allied material deployment exceeded even his estimates. He'd calculated Allied vehicle landing capacity at approximately 8,000 to 10,000 per day across all beaches combined. Actual observations suggested rates closer to 12,000 per day. By June 8th, Wehrmacht intelligence estimated that Allied forces had already landed over 30,000 vehicles in Normandy. The number seemed impossible. German units would require months to transport 30,000 vehicles over similar distances, even without enemy interdiction. Yet there it was in the reports, described by multiple independent observers. More disturbing, those 30,000 vehicles were just the beginning. Reconnaissance photographs showed hundreds more ships approaching the invasion beaches. The vehicle landing operations showed no signs of slowing. Weber compiled a new report, documenting the observed Allied logistical capabilities and comparing them to his pre-invasion projections. His predictions had been accurate within 15%. He submitted the report through channels on June 10th, not expecting any response. To his surprise, he was summoned to brief Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel on June 12th. Weber had never met Keitel personally. The chief of the Wehrmacht High Command was Hitler's most loyal military subordinate, known for his absolute obedience to the Führer's directives, regardless of military realities. The meeting was brief and tense. Keitel sat behind an enormous desk in his office, Weber's report open before him. 2 staff officers stood nearby. Keitel began without preamble. Your report suggests you predicted the scale of Allied logistical operations in Normandy with considerable accuracy. Yes, Field Marshal. My pre-invasion estimates were based on, I've read your methodology. Keitel's voice was cold. What I want to know is why these estimates weren't given more weight in our operational planning. Weber chose his words carefully. My reports were submitted through proper channels. The conclusions were deemed overly pessimistic by senior officers who reviewed them. Overly pessimistic. Keitel's repetition dripped with contempt, though whether directed at Weber or those who'd dismissed his work, Weber couldn't tell. The Allies have landed over 40,000 vehicles in 6 days, Colonel. Your overly pessimistic estimates are proving conservative. Yes, Field Marshal. Keitel leaned forward. Give me your honest assessment. Can we defeat this invasion? Weber understood this was the moment. He could provide comfortable assurances, preserve his career, tell a field marshal what he wanted to hear, or he could tell the truth. No, Field Marshal, we cannot. Silence filled the office. The staff officers exchanged glances. Explain, Keitel said quietly. The Allies possess material superiority of approximately 8 to 1-inch vehicles, similar ratios in artillery, and absolute air superiority that makes our armoured movement by daylight suicidal. They can sustain these ratios indefinitely through continuous shipping operations. Germany cannot match Allied vehicle replacement rates, even if we transferred our entire remaining production to Western Front. We're facing industrial capacity against which military skill alone is insufficient. You're saying Germany should surrender? I'm saying mathematics dictates outcomes regardless of ideology or determination. The Allies can absorb losses we inflict while replacing their losses faster than we can inflict them. They can advance, stall, absorb casualties, regroup, and attack again because their logistical capacity is effectively unlimited. We cannot do the same. Each German loss is irreplaceable. Each Allied loss is temporary. Another long silence. Then Keitel spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been resignation. "Your report is noted, Colonel. That will be all." Weber saluted and left, certain his career was over. At minimum, he expected reassignment to a frontline unit. Intelligent officers who delivered unwelcome truths often found themselves transferred to positions where their inconvenient honesty could be silenced by enemy action. Instead, nothing happened. He remained at his Bendler block office, continuing his usual work, filing daily intelligence summaries that now documented Allied advances no one could deny. By July 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy was accelerating. Operation Cobra punched through German defences, and American armoured divisions were racing across France at speeds that dwarfed the 1,940 Blitzkrieg. Von Schelling, still Inspector General of Western Panzer Forces, travelled to the front attempting to assess remaining defensive capacity. What he saw appalled. German units were being destroyed not through tactical inferiority but through material exhaustion. Panzer divisions fought brilliantly, ambushed Allied columns, executed textbook defensive operations, and then ran out of fuel, ammunition, or replacement parts, and had to abandon their positions or be annihilated. Meanwhile, Allied forces seemed to operate with logistical abundance that defied military logic. Destroyed American tanks were replaced within hours. Entire supply columns appeared overnight. Artillery barrages were maintained at intensities that consumed more ammunition in single engagements than German divisions had available for entire campaigns. Von Schelling watched American supply operations through binoculars from a ridgeline south of Saint-Lô. An endless convoy of American trucks stretched to the horizon, moving supplies forward in volumes that made German logistics look pre-industrial by comparison. He counted over 200 trucks passing a single checkpoint in 20 minutes. The Americans weren't just winning through superior numbers, they were winning through superior logistics. Their trucks didn't break down. Their fuel arrived on schedule. Their replacement parts were abundant. The vaunted German mechanical engineering expertise meant nothing when American vehicles, supposedly inferior in quality, simply worked reliably, while German tanks sat immobilized waiting for spare parts that never arrived. In August 1944, von Schelling was summoned to Paris for emergency command discussions. The Allied breakout had become a rout. German forces were retreating toward the Seine River, attempting to establish new defensive lines that everyone knew wouldn't hold. At the conference, von Schelling encountered Weber again. The intelligence analyst looked exhausted, hollow-eyed from months of watching his predictions materialize as catastrophe. "Your numbers were right," von Schelling said simply. "Everything you warned about, the vehicle superiority, the logistical capacity, the material abundance. It's exactly as you calculated." Weber nodded, but took no satisfaction from the vindication. "Did you know America has now delivered over 400,000 vehicles to Allied forces? That's just documented deliveries. Actual numbers are probably higher. They're producing military vehicles faster than we're destroying them, even with our most optimistic combat loss claims." 400,000, von Schelling repeated numbly. While fighting Japan, while maintaining homeland defense, while supplying the Soviet Union. The Americans converted their automobile industry to military production in less than 18 months. Weber continued. Ford's Willow Run plant alone produces one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. General Motors manufactures more military trucks monthly than Germany produces in a year. And they're doing this while their civilian population maintains living standards Germany hasn't seen since before the war. Von Schelling poured himself schnapps from a bottle on the conference table. We never had a chance, did we? Not once America entered the war with full industrial mobilization. No, Weber agreed. Germany might have survived a limited war with controlled objectives, but total war against an enemy with America's industrial base and resources. The outcome was mathematically predetermined from 1942 onward. Everything since has been delayed inevitability. The Paris conference broke up without reaching meaningful conclusions. What could be concluded? That Germany was losing a war it could never have won. That Allied material superiority was insurmountable, that years of suffering and sacrifice had been in pursuit of strategic impossibility. By September 1944, Allied forces had liberated Paris and were approaching Germany's western border. Soviet forces were destroying Army Group Center and approaching the Reich's eastern frontiers. Italy had collapsed. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The Luftwaffe was shattered. The Kriegsmarine was bottled in ports, and still the American vehicles kept arriving. Weber's intelligence summaries documented 450,000 by October 1944, then 500,000 by December. The numbers climbed, while Germany's production capacity collapsed under Allied bombing. Weber sat in his Berlin office in December 1944, compiling what he knew would be one of his final reports. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. The war was clearly lost. Germany's cities were rubble. Its armies were disintegrating. Yet his job remained. Count the numbers, document the reality, maintain the record. His final calculation showed that American vehicle deliveries to Allied forces had exceeded 520,000 units by year's end 1944. This represented more vehicles than Germany had produced in its entire history prior to 1933. Weber wrote in his concluding paragraph, American industrial capacity exceeded German planning assumptions by margins that made military resistance strategically futile from 1942 onward. This conclusion was evident in production data available by mid-1943, but was rejected by senior command due to ideological preconceptions about American capability. Strategic planning based on wishful thinking rather than empirical assessment produced catastrophic consequences that no amount of tactical excellence could overcome. He filed the report, knowing it would never be read by anyone who could have acted on it when action mattered. The record existed nonetheless. Someday, perhaps, it would answer historians' questions about how an entire military leadership could have been so fundamentally wrong about the enemy they faced. In April 1945, with Soviet forces blocks away and Berlin collapsing into chaos, Weber destroyed most of his files. He kept only a single leather portfolio containing his key reports and statistical analyses, evidence that someone in the Wehrmacht had understood the truth, even if no one had listened. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Weber survived, was briefly interned by American forces, and was eventually released after his intelligence role was determined to be analytical rather than operational. Years later, military historians would examine captured German documents and marvel at the intelligence failures that led Wehrmacht commanders to underestimate Allied, particularly American, capabilities so catastrophically. They would write about ideological blindness, wishful thinking, and strategic delusion. Few would note the small analytical section that had accurately assessed American industrial capacity, predicted Allied logistical superiority, and warned of strategic impossibility. Weber's reports existed in archives, largely unexamined footnotes to a catastrophe. Von Schelling also survived the war, surrendered to American forces in April 1945, and spent 3 years in a POW camp. During interrogations, American intelligence officers asked him about German defensive planning for the Normandy invasion. "We planned to fight an enemy we understood," von Schelling told his interrogators. "We prepared for an invasion we could conceptually defeat. What arrived on those beaches was something else entirely: industrial capacity, weaponized on a scale we had no framework to comprehend. You didn't win because your soldiers were better than ours. You won because you brought so many vehicles, so much ammunition, so much fuel, that our tactical excellence became irrelevant. You could afford mistakes we couldn't. You could sustain advances we couldn't stop, not because we didn't fight hard enough, but because mathematics doesn't care about courage. The American officer conducting the interrogation paused his note-taking. You sound like you're not surprised we won. I've known since June 7th, 1944, that Germany would lose, von Schelling replied. I probably should have known in June 1943, when an intelligence analyst showed me production figures I didn't want to believe. The tragedy is that so many men died in the year between knowing and accepting. The story of how America sent over 300,000 vehicles to Allied forces, while simultaneously fighting Japan, never became a celebrated narrative of the war. There were no dramatic films made about logistics officers and production statistics. The men who built trucks in Detroit and shipped them to Liverpool weren't remembered like the men who stormed beaches and liberated cities. But in the cramped Berlin office where Colonel Friedrich Weber had spent 3 years documenting what everyone refused to believe, and in the French hedgerows where General Kurt von Schelling had watched American supply columns that stretched to the horizon, the real verdict of the war was written in numbers that didn't lie. Germany lost World War II on many battlefields and through countless factors. But perhaps it was lost most definitively in the arithmetic that Colonel Weber had compiled in 1943, arithmetic that showed America's industrial colossus producing war material at rates that made German victory mathematically impossible. The officers who had dismissed those calculations learned the truth in the skies over Normandy filled with aircraft, on beaches covered with vehicles, and in the endless supply columns that sustained Allied advances no matter how many times German forces struck them. By the time they understood what Weber's numbers had meant, it was far too late to matter. The final irony was simple. Germany spent years being told America was weak, industrially inferior, strategically incoherent. When reality arrived on June 6, 1944, it arrived in such overwhelming material abundance that German defenders could only watch in shock as everything they'd believed was proven catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. The numbers had never lied. Only the men reading them had refused to see what they meant. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to post, subscribe,